The first intellectuals to examine the Industrial Revolution and its problems had little to offer the urban worker, ironically, precisely because they were products of the Enlightenment. That is, like all Enlightenment thinkers, the first philosophers, economists, social reformers, and political writers who examined the Industrial Revolution believed so strongly in science and progress, in the natural goodness of man, in the reliability of human reason, in the need to get away from intrusive governments and state churches and to clear away restraints on personal freedom, that they could only see the good that the Industrial Revolution had brought. These writers argued, in the best Enlightenment fashion, that human reason, unchecked by government regulation and censorship, would eventually produce paradise on earth. Perhaps even more ironically, these writers were the first liberals. Now, the word liberal is a loaded one in our society. In some circles, it has come to be associated with a kind of soft-headed socialism, knee-jerk pacifism, high taxes, big government, the tyranny of speech and thought known as political correctness, and an abdication of personal responsibility. But classically, the first liberals believed none of this. The first liberals, reacting against Catholic theology in particular, believed that people are inherently good and rational and reasonable. And therefore, they don't need absolute governments and state churches and censorship and surveillance to tell them how to behave. Rather, a free interchange of ideas, goods, and services would result in an enlightened utopia for all. So, when modern conservatives call for small government, deregulation of industry, free trade, personal freedom of behavior and speech, they are being good classical liberals. There are, of course, countervailing tendencies in mainstream conservative thought that owe to older traditions. So fine, Professor Bucholz, if modern conservatives are really classical liberals, where did the modern liberals come from? How did they acquire their modern connotations? Part of the answer to that question is to be found in the sheer human misery of the Industrial Revolution, which forced liberals to change. We can see this by examining some early liberals and how their thought evolved. Now, the roots of liberalism go back to the Renaissance, the Age of Reason, and the Enlightenment. But if we had to pin it down, it could be argued that John Locke was the first true liberal, with his belief that human beings are born neither good nor bad, but become so as a result of their environment. That they are naturally rational and will, if left to their own devices, choose rational solutions. That they are or should be free to contract with each other to form society, contract with a ruler to form government, and have the right to dissolve that contract once the ruler breaks it. And also the idea that differing ideas about religion, and by implication about how we should all live, should be tolerated. But the first great liberal to confront industrialization was Adam Smith. Adam Smith started out as a professor at the University of Glasgow. He published his great work, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, in 1776, which, if you stop and think about it, was quite a good year for liberalism. He published it after leaving the university. Like the work of Hobbes and Locke, it claimed to be scientific, the first scientific examination of how economies actually work as opposed to how they should work. Like Newton, Smith claimed to have discovered that the economic world runs like the natural world, according to unvarying natural laws. Money, goods, services orbit the planet the way the planet orbits the sun, naturally, unvaryingly. For example, the law of supply and demand. Man, using his reason, can discover those laws. To tamper with those laws, to impede that flow via government regulations, tariff barriers, high taxes, subsidies for failing industries, guilds and monopolies, minimum or maximum wage laws, serfdom, or with mercantilism, protectionism, or feudalism, only retarded economic progress. According to Smith, all you had to do was look at 18th century France and Eastern Europe to see that. Rather, world and national economies were healthiest when they were left alone, when trade was free, when individuals pursued their own self-interest. When they did so, an invisible hand, the market, would take care of all. Pursuit of individual self-interest multiplied across society generated demand, production, distribution, and wealth, which trickles down, a modern phrase, not Smith's, to all. in his own words. Every individual necessarily labors to render the annual revenue of the society as great as he can. He generally, indeed, neither intends to promote the public interest, nor knows how much he is promoting it. He intends only his own gain, and he is in this, as in many other cases, led by an invisible hand to promote an end which was no part of his intention. By pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. In fact, Smith argues, benevolence, charity, altruism, while virtuous, did not really improve the lot of the poor. It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we can expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own self-interest. The Wealth of Nations is still the Bible of laissez-faire liberalism. It has been heralded ever since as one of the great books of the Western world, and it was immediately attractive to the British middle class. They embraced it. After all, it said, get rid of aristocratic privilege, clear the decks, get rid of expensive colonies and trade barriers, get rid of government regulations which might interfere with the unseen hand, or defend workers, or restrict profits. Don't divert those profits into charity. Pour them back into your economic enterprise. Thomas Malthus's essay on population of 1798 was almost as famous, but far more frightening. Where Smith uncovered a world in which all were on their own, but all benefited, Malthus's reason and scientific inquiries revealed something darker, a world doomed by simple math. Malthus noted that the world's food supply increases arithmetically, that is, gradually. But population increases geometrically. It doubles, then it squares itself. The conclusion is obvious. Sooner or later, with the inevitability of a scientific law, that population is going to outrun the food supply. The only things that slow down this process are demographic disasters, famines, wars, epidemics, natural disasters. Unfortunately, human life was being preserved and the planet further depleted by modern medicine, peace, and charity, all of which encourage the poor to have more children. And so their poverty was inevitable. Any attempt to relieve it only made things worse. Now, before you hate Malthus, you should know that he was a kind and gentle clergyman who was horrified by what his scientific inquiries had uncovered. But he was also a professor of political economy and history. Science was science, math was math, and he could not deny them to make his conclusions more palatable. Malthus's conclusions have remained controversial to this day. Now, he failed to foresee the ability of science and technology to increase the food supply. And yet, his general point, that the resources of the planet are finite, while the potential increase in the population is limitless, seems, to me at least, to be inescapable. David Ricardo's Principles of Political Economy and Taxation of 1817 made these depressing connections even clearer. This work formulated what has become known as the iron law of wages. It goes like this. If the population of workers is low, employers must compete to attract and keep workers, which they will do by offering higher wages. High wages will mean better workers' health. Better workers' health will mean more workers' children. More workers' children will mean more workers. More workers will mean they must compete with each other for the same number of jobs. Lots of workers competing with each other means that wages will fall. If a worker doesn't like his job, he can always be replaced because now there are lots of workers because the workers have all been reproducing, because they're healthy, because they're paid so well. Lower wages, which will happen with so many workers competing for these jobs, will eventually mean poorer health and less pre-production and less workers, and the whole cycle will begin over again. No wonder economics is sometimes referred to as the dismal science. Those natural economic laws, of which Adam Smith was so fond, turn out to doom the working class to an eternal boom and bust cycle. By fulfilling their own natural laws, the very human desire to reproduce, they doom themselves and subsequent generations to eternal poverty. Now, none of these men were evil. They didn't take delight in the sometimes depressing implications of their thought. They were rational. They were enlightened. They were scientists. In their view, the facts of the case, or at least they thought they were scientists, in their view, the facts of the case simply could not be escaped. But many in the middle class used these theories to justify untempered greed, or at least neglect of the problems of the new urban poor. Workers seemed to have no recourse as a result. The 1790s to the 1820s saw increasing signs of labor unrest, especially in Britain. Most spectacularly, between 1811 and 1817, the Luddites broke up machines. Early in 1811, a General Ned Ludd and the Army of Redressers sent anonymous threatening letters to factory owners in Nottingham. Workers complained of wage cuts and the use of unapprenticed workmen. They broke into factories at night and they wrecked industrial machinery. The movement eventually spread throughout the north of England, the heart of the Industrial Revolution. In February of 1812, the British government passed the Frame Breaking Act, making machine breaking a capital offense. Now remember that this all took place during the worst economic times of the Napoleonic Wars, when the continental system drove the British economy into recession. In 1812, wheat prices soared. Workers unable to feed their families rioted for bread throughout the North and Midlands. Government troops just back from the Napoleonic Wars were activated to suppress those riots, which did generally end by 1817. In the meantime, classical liberalism faced a challenge from a new kind of liberal, the utilitarian. The utilitarians were founded by Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham was a child prodigy. He had read serious treatises at the age of 3. He played the violin at age 5. He studied Latin and French at age 6 and entered the University of Oxford at 12, beating me by a full decade. He outlined his views in Principles of Morals and Legislation of 1789. Now, like all Enlightenment thinkers, Bentham believed in reason. But he was less interested in using reason to discover unvarying laws of nature and economics. Rather, he believed that reason could be used to discover laws which benefited men, not nature. In his view, institutions should be based on and measured against not what was natural, but what was practical, what was beneficial, what was useful, hence the term utilitarianism. So what was useful? Bentham believed that the best society, the best government, the best institutions were those which brought the greatest happiness to the greatest number. Now, put simply, any law, any belief, any institution which didn't do that should be abolished, including aristocracy, the state religion, and slavery. A coalition of Quakers, Anglican bishops, and utilitarians actually did secure parliamentary abolition of, first, the slave trade in 1807, and then slavery itself in the British Empire in 1833. Utilitarians also wanted to reform English common law, the schools, the poor law, and the prisons. They equally demanded an end to press censorship, universal manhood suffrage. Most Enlightenment writers, and I do mean manhood, most Enlightenment writers still denied full reason to women. So Bentham is reminiscent of Adam Smith in that he wants barriers and unfair privilege abolished. He's not explicitly arguing for the creation of lots of new institutions, but for the reform of those which stand in people's way. To that extent, he's a classical liberal. Even so, he is advocating a degree of intervention on the part of the government which we've not seen in liberals before. Moreover, in focusing on utility, on the human condition as opposed to something so abstract as nature or the economy, he's encouraging his many followers to focus on the real world. Is it relevant to note here that Smith, Malthus, and Ricardo were all professors, a group which can sometimes be guilty of missing out on real life? Indeed, I am told that there is a great world beyond this studio, which I hope to examine upon my release. Once liberals began to focus on that real world, on actual human problems, they begin to argue for more radical change. And that brings us to John Stuart Mill. John Stuart Mill was a utilitarian, and he's often taught in the classroom as the classic example of the classical liberal. But I'm going to argue that his experience of the British industrial world would change him into something more like the liberals we know today. Well, John Stuart Mill was the son of James Mill, himself a very distinguished utilitarian philosopher and a follower of Bentham. Mill was famously precocious from a young age. He spent his early years in study. He began to learn Greek at age 3. By 17, he had mastered Greek, philosophy, chemistry, and botany. This course of study eventually led to a kind of psychological breakdown, which he describes very movingly in the autobiography. He worked for the East India Company until its dissolution in 1858, at which point he was able to retire. He was elected MP for Westminster, Member of Parliament, in 1865. He published lots of books. The Principles of Political Economy in 1848. On Liberty in 1859 is his most famous work, and it shows him to be a conventional Benthamite liberal. In this book, Mill promotes political reform, universal suffrage. Mill, a feminist, was heavily influenced by his brilliant wife, Harriet Taylor. He still advocates a laissez-faire economy. Overall, his idea is that human beings should be as free as possible from constraint. Quote, "The sole end for which mankind may interfere with the liberty of action of the individual is self-protection. Mill wants to reduce the reach and power of government. That government is best, which governs least." You can see why he's taught as a classical liberal and why many conservatives embrace him today. But by the time of On Liberty, by the time it was published, Mill's views were already beginning to change. In Principles on Representative Government, published in 1861, in subsequent editions of the Principles of Political Economy, and above all as a member of Parliament, Mill began to confront the Industrial Revolution on a day-to-day basis and argue for a more interventionist policy. Now, Mill still wants universal suffrage, but he reasons it's not enough to give the people a vote. What good is a vote if you can't read a newspaper or write your MP? How can you exercise your vote wisely if you don't know any history? Since for the previous 1800 years of British history, the churches and the charities had very largely failed to educate the British people in this, Mill begins to argue for the provision of free public education for all. But what good is education and a vote if you and your family are so poor that you have to vote as your boss or your landlord dictates? What good is a vote or an education if you die at 17? Mill concluded that only the government has the resources to protect workers, especially children, from the raw workings of the market. Only the government has the resources to improve and even provide housing and health care. In short, John Stuart Mill, classical liberal, came to believe that if democracy is the best form of government, it depends on the virtue and intelligence of the voters. That connection is so important that government, in his view, has an obligation, quote, to promote the virtue and intelligence of the people. Mill became a new kind of liberal. He still believed in untrammeled personal freedom so long as others didn't get hurt. He still believed in small government if possible. But that freedom no longer included the right to exploit the poor or deny them an education or housing or votes. Rather, to ensure the maximum amount of freedom for all had an obligation to educate all, to house all, to protect all. If that meant restricting the economic freedom of factory owners, so be it. If that meant using the power of government to improve the lot of the worker and the poor, so be it. If that meant higher taxes on the aristocracy and rising middle class, so be it. In fact, towards the end of his life, John Stuart Mill began to urge workers to form trade unions and demand better wages and even profit sharing. He even questioned the sanctity of private property. Faced with the hard realities of the Industrial Revolution, John Stuart Mill became Ted Kennedy. Now, these ideas are fascinating, but did they have any effect? The answer to that question is a qualified yes. First, only in Western Europe. In Eastern and Southern Europe, liberalism was pretty much irrelevant. No one had a vote. Many don't even have their own country yet. Finns, Poles, Czechs, Ukrainians, Croats, etc. There's hardly any press to be free. There's no working class. Many peasants were still serfs. So talking about liberalism in Eastern Europe was like talking about exercise to someone with a fatal disease. Even in Western Europe at first, only the first kind of liberalism, classical liberalism, only that was implemented, and only that benefited the middle class at first. Mill's liberalism took longer and only began to benefit workers after 1850, and so after this lecture. First, let's talk about Britain to 1850, and then we'll talk about France. During the early years of the Industrial Revolution, Britain retained many elements of the Ancien regime. It was still ruled by King George III, who had more or less gone insane from about 1811 on. Parliament was elected only by the wealthiest landowners and townsmen. In the wake of the French Revolution in the 1790s, the press was heavily censored, the right of assembly severely curtailed. Between 1815 and 1820, there was a period of economic depression, middle and working class agitation, and government repression. The reason for the economic depression has something to do with Napoleon's continental system, which had hurt the British. They were still recovering. But the war had also left a massive government debt. And the end of the war led to overproduction. British industrial manufacturers expected at the end of the war to be able to get back their markets in Europe. They expected a massive European demand, and they produced for it. The trouble was, Europe was so devastated by war that it couldn't afford British products. Then there was a series of bad harvests and the Luddite riots that we noted previously. The middle class was demanding the vote. The conservative government of Lord Liverpool faced lots of challenges. It responded by protecting aristocratic landowners. First thing they did when the war was over, they repealed the land tax. Remember, they still got huge debt to pay off. Then they put high tariffs on foreign grains, the Corn Laws. In Britain, the word corn applies to wheat. The idea was to keep up the price of domestically grown wheat. To benefit who? The aristocratic landowners. Remember, this means poor people have trouble affording grain. Liverpool called in the troops just back from Europe to put down popular unrest. We've already seen that. In 1819, a rally of middle-class families and workers calling for reform, meeting in St. Peter's Fields outside of Manchester, was run down by British cavalry. This became known as the Peterloo Massacre. And here I should probably explain that in 19th century British satire, the word loo came to mean the same thing that gate does in American parlance. You know, any scandal is a gate. Well, any scandal in the 19th century was very often a loo of some kind. Parliament responded with the notorious 6 Acts, which further restricted the right to assemble. Houses could be searched for seditious and blasphemous pamphlets. Authors could be imprisoned for such writing. High taxes were placed on cheap newspapers to keep them out of the hands of literate workers. Britain's Ancien regime was drawing a line in the sand and trying to preserve what was left of the great chain of being. But one of the most important forces in history is sometimes just generational change. The old die off and are replaced by the young. Around 1820, a new generation of British politicians, like George Canning and Sir Robert Peel, took power. They came from middle-class backgrounds. They were raised on the classical liberals and utilitarians, and they launched a series of reforms designed to wipe away old, irrational, oppressive measures. In 1822, they reformed the criminal code, abolishing many capital crimes. In 1824, they repealed the Combination Acts, which had prohibited workers from forming trade unions. In 1828, they repealed the Test and the Corporation Acts, which made it difficult for non-conforming Protestants, that is, non-Anglicans, to serve in government. In 1830, they repealed the penal laws against Catholics, which had banned them from public office and university education. In 1833, as we have seen, they outlawed slavery and also, via the Factory Act, child labor before the age of 9. 10 to 13-year-olds could still be worked 9 hours a day, 13 to 17-year-olds 12 hours a day. Most famously, in 1832, a Whig ministry passed the Great Reform Act. Parliament was redistricted. Seats were taken away from depopulated areas and given to new industrial towns like Manchester. Property requirements for voting were also lowered, so that now middle-class men had the vote. Now note that qualification. Both workers and middle-class owners and shopkeepers had agitated for the Reform Act, like at St. Peter's Fields. Remember, it was workers as well as the middle class. Workers hoped that now that the middle class had the vote, they would return the favor. But the middle class had what they wanted. They had the vote, they had legal reform, they had greater freedom within a still hierarchical system. They didn't see a need for further reform. Now that they were in Parliament, they shut the door behind them. And so in the 1830s and 40s, British workers began to agitate for a new constitution, a national charter which would have been England's first written constitution. It was to guarantee universal suffrage, a secret ballot, that's very important if you're a vulnerable worker, equal representation, equal districts, no property qualifications for voting, salaried MPs. If you give MP, we often complain about the salaries for congressmen, but if you don't pay them, then only the rich can serve. Workers engaged in torchlight parades and mass rallies and membership drives. They wrote newspapers and pamphlets. But when in 1839 the National Charter came before Parliament, that body, now dominated by the aristocracy and the middle class, voted it down, 235 to 46. It was voted down again in 1842 and in 1847. It would take most of the middle of the 19th century to persuade the great British middle class that what was good for the goose really was good for the gander as well, and even longer still before they came to see things like John Stuart Mill. What about France? By the time of Napoleon's fall, France was well on its way to industrialization. Moreover, the revolution had accelerated the development of an ambitious middle class, while the seeming defeat of the revolution in 1815 had also restored the monarchy and aristocracy to a qualified power in France. In other words, you have a strong middle class, but remember that the Ancien Regime is to some extent restored. This was going to lead to conflict. Now, Louis XVIII was the restored Bourbon king who presided over France between 1814 and 1824. He was a conciliatory and popular figure. He tried to unite the nation. He's probably the kindest of all the Bourbons. His legislature was divided, however, between conservative royalists or ultras. They wanted to scrap the Constitution and revive the glory days of Louis XIV. And liberals, led by the Marquis de Lafayette. Yes, that Marquis de Lafayette, still going strong, who wanted an even more liberal constitution and a wider franchise. In 1824, Louis XVIII died and was succeeded by his reactionary brother Charles X. This is going to prove that kings of France are much better off calling themselves Louis. Charles X mounted a massive coronation designed to send a signal about the sanctity of the French monarchy. It was like something out of the 17th century. He compensated aristocrats whose land had been confiscated during the French Revolution. He restored control of education to the church. And much more alarmingly, in 1830, he issued the 5 Ordinances, a French version of the 6 Acts. He dissolved the legislature. He imposed a strict censorship of the press. He began gerrymandering electoral districts with a view to producing a more compliant legislature. In short, Charles X, having lived through the French Revolution, was determined to undo it. But you could never go home again. In July of 1830, Paris erupted into a second French Revolution. Middle-class intellectuals wrote pamphlets denouncing the 5 Ordinances. Workers and students erected barricades in the narrow medieval streets of Paris, paralyzing the city, making it impossible to bring in troops. Beginning on the 26th of July, there was 3 days of street fighting. It killed 5,700 people, mostly students and workers. Within weeks, the king, Charles X, abdicated and fled to Britain, and the French legislature chose Louis Philippe, Duke of Orleans, in his place, hence the term the July Monarchy. Louis Philippe was an aristocrat with the soul of a factory owner. He was sort of a citizen king. His virtues were thoroughly middle class. He was thrifty, he was kindly, he was hardworking, and he was unpretentious. He appointed capable ministries which encouraged industry. He's a bit like a factory owner. He's looking for good professionals. He approved a liberal constitution which widened the franchise to include more of the middle class. Still, the French electorate is only about 5 to 6% of the population. He removed censorship of the press. As for workers, who you remember had mounted the barricades along with students and paid most of the price, they didn't get much out of the July Revolution. Some child labor laws were passed in 1841. That was about it. As for the German states, which are slowly becoming Western at this time, they're mostly ruled by small and very conservative autocracies, absolute monarchies, liberalism was mainly an idea confined to the universities and their students. So in conclusion, for now, by the 1830s, liberalism had given the middle classes in Britain and France what they wanted. It had given them the franchise and the political power it implied. It had removed old, irrational, aristocratic privileges and censorship, and it had given them complete economic freedom. As for the workers, the franchise and political power continued to be denied them. The removal of privileges was nice, but their bosses' economic freedom made it all the easier for them to be exploited. It would not be until the second half of the 19th century that Mill's later ideas, and with them a greater sense of responsibility for workers, would begin to gain traction with the middle class and in the government. In the meantime, other, more radical philosophies would fill the void.